Hi everyone, this is Juniper the Pig, or Brandy J Lewis, and this is Furry History, a conversation held at Anthrocon 2024. Now, the tricky part with panels is that as you're getting set up, it's this great opportunity to check in with one another, to talk about work that's been going on, to ask how the convention's been going, and I got a little excited and nervous and forgot to hit record at the start of the panel. This is the second time that this has actually happened to me, and I promise next time it's not going to happen again. But we have Chipper, we have Tofte Alpaca, and we have Bash Pinata here talking about furry history, the difficulties, the nuances that come with it, and the processes we go through as we try to tell these stories. And so you're listening to Furry History, a conversation from Anthrocon 2024.
But the first time that I learned the word furry was during winter break of my first year of college in 2000. I was home watching MTV, like you did at the time, and there was a new series called Sex 2K, which explored different sort of alternative spooky sexualities, things, such bizarre things as bondage, and and there was an episode of this that is cut down from a documentary by Rick Castro, who's a kink documentarian and photographer, called Plushies and Furries. And Plushies and Furries, some of you might have seen it, a lot of you might not have. When it came out, it fell into the same category as a lot of non-furry coverage of furries in the early 2000s. And basically that just meant a lot of people reacted to this as, oh, furry is just a weird sex cult, and it's just people getting around and fucking in fursuits. And on the one hand, sure, right, but at the time, for me, I saw it and I had this epiphany of like, there are people out there like me. Like, I thought I was weird, and I am, right? But at least there's some more people out there. So, so that is my exposure to furry for the first time.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that story, and I think particularly when you bring up this idea of pockets, how we construct the idea of something is often, as we know, based in narrative and what we see of the world, how we understand it in terms of like the stories we tell about it. And I think in particular, furry is understood from like this cultural panic of like the other within socio-economic, cultural products and whatnot. But then also like once you get in the midst of it, like Chipper with your suits, you realize there's so many like breakaway points, so many pleasures, if you want to use that word, that changes that a little bit. And it messes with the stories and the histories we tell, right? I guess that leads to my next question, which for you all, why history? What drew you to the question of furries' genealogies, its lineages, and maybe producing kind of works that looked at furries' history? Whoever wants to start.
I don't know, I found myself just liking niche history. Like, if there is a topic that hasn't had any history involved in it, I like going in and actually writing it myself. Like, I went to a military academy, which is kind of like a dying type of educational institution. So I was like, oh, it'd be fun to do the history of just my military school. And I realized, oh, I couldn't tell the history of my military school without talking about the history of military schools, and no one's written that book. So I went back and basically had to write that book. Same with the Japanese visual novel industry, which I did in college, and then that eventually led me to conventions. And because I noticed that comic fans will only talk about the comic conventions, furries will only talk about the furry stuff. I want to show it's all part of this larger tree, which hasn't been connected yet. And that's more my interest was furries. Our family tree is much larger than we like to think.
Yeah.
And that's why I went to the history to try to show that.
Yeah, so why history? My background, as I said, is in English, so I don't know. I write essays with arguments about literature usually, and that's a style. That's a thing that I guess has an audience. Although I think there's sort of fandom should be applied to academia too, because academia sees itself as very high and mighty, but I think it's actually just a bunch of small fandoms.
Yeah.
But history is a different project, and so I didn't understand at the start of Fang, Feather, and Fin what I was doing, honestly. But then I started to understand when I was writing my first articles, first on kind of the early history of TF and furry, and another one on Furry Muck from like 1989, 1990, 1991. And I just learned that history is being a sponge. Like, you sit with material and you let it come to you, and you create a document that's 50 pages long of like interview notes and things you found from all these chat logs and just like, I don't know, like Usenet group archives and all these different things from different places. And I really like this project of sitting with material from disparate places and starting to find the connections between them. That I just think is really cool, because you get to understand what the story was, and then you get to tell the story. It's hard work, and it comes with a sort of moral valence too, because it's like, I want to be a complete historian. I don't want to leave parts of the story off, so I'm always nervous that I'm going to be missing parts. That's especially a problem with digital furry history, because a lot of things disappear, especially from the early internet. So it's hard to deal with this problem of like what goes missing.
So two separate answers to this one. So I'm trained as a classicist, and I study mostly things that are about 2,000 years old, give or take. And the situation that we're dealing with in my field is, it's like trying to piece together a puzzle where 95% of the pieces have been lost, and also you don't have the box top showing what it should have looked like in the first place. Yeah. And something that I find really exciting, and also, a little anxiety producing about furry history is, it hasn't been 2,000 years since furry began. We are still in a period where the first generation of furs are with us, at least partly. And so we're at a time where we could actually preserve things, and where we could actually study and create clear narratives, or capacious narratives about what's going on and what this has meant to us. So partly it's sort of motivated by that, but there's a lot of just kind of personal stuff built in. Something that got me into classics was getting to see queer people in antiquity. And so I got to see that, again, like, I'm not the only one. This has always been here. And so, like, there's a lot of personal connection that I have with doing history. I remember that when I was in college, to buy furry media, to buy furry comics, I got a secret job that nobody knew about. I was working at a terrible boutique hotel in Boston called the Beacon Inn. Do not stay there. Fun fact, if you're in one of the back rooms, you can't stop people from coming into your room. There's a weird thing. It's a set of brownstones. There are laws about how you have to have emergency access to fire egress. And so, you can't stop people from pushing into your room. Don't stay there. So I got a secret job, I got a secret bank account, and I started buying things from Rabbit Valley. And I had read these stories about comic shops being raided, and about people going to jail for having furry comics. Yeah. And I got really interested, and I was terrified. I was waiting for the cops to come into my dorm and look at my copies of Circles and Associated Student Bodies and throw me in federal prison for 80 years, right? And part of I think the motivation to do history is like, what actually happened? Like, why did I have that fear? What was the representation of that? What was the reality of that? It is true. It is true that in 1985 and in 1990, 1991, there was a spate of raids of police shops in the US and Canada and in New Zealand, and people went to jail, and people had their careers and their lives ruined because of, especially Omaha the Cat Dancer, which is arguably the first furry erotic comic. Is also arguably not a furry comic, but an underground comic. Or whatever you want to do with those lines. So so personal. There's a lot of personal motivation built into doing history.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to this question, that now that we're kind of in that space, did you, maybe you two can speak to it, did you feel any apprehension on the projects you were working on? Maybe for you more recently with the transformation stuff, have you felt like going into this project has opened up maybe loopholes that you didn't realize as you were dancing with the material?
I guess like for TF specifically, I lean more towards Ace, and all my stuff is family friendly. I keep it family friendly. And then there was a weird, I'm not gonna name the con, but there's a furry con that decided to make my I do a TF panel at almost every con, and they decided to make it a plus 18 panel and put it like 2 hours after closing ceremonies to try and push it away from the family friendly stuff, which I thought was kind of odd. I was like, and that was the first time I realized, a lot of people don't see transformation as, I see it as just a narrative genre.
Right.
Other people, I guess, see it as, I guess, a kink, which I don't see it like that. And especially when you go more in towards my more niche interest in animate transformation, because it's even rarer to have stories of people turning to objects. And I think that's a really unique trope. Right. And what's ironic is most people in that subgenre are actually very Ace. But a lot of people see that as a kink because it is a big kink in some other pockets, like especially in the anime community. Like it might be a kink there, but in another community it might not be. So that kind of made me had to reevaluate how I approach stuff. But then doing the con history stuff and seeing this has been a thing over and over again. In the 1920s, we had Tijuana Bibles. Right. In the 1960s, we had Dondinshi. And then the entire Star Trek convention scene. They had a thing, their dealer's den equivalent is called a huckster's hall. And they would sell like a lot of slash fiction, slash came from that, homoerotic stuff, especially between Kirk and Spock. And at one Star Trek convention in Tulsa, they actually had the cops called on them. And someone gave the con a heads up, and all the dealers who were selling this had to clear out within an hour before the cops came. But all that resulted in was Star Trek cons as a whole kind of dying, and then Star Trek slash cons going on the rise. Because a year after, IDI Con was formed. It was a Star Trek con that was nothing but selling slash. That's actually how Comic Con, Comic Cat was formed. The original Dondinshi artists who were drawing their anime slash what's called Dondinshi were doing it at science fiction cons in Japan. And the science fiction cons were so overwhelmed by these Dondinshi circles, they kicked them out, and they basically spun off and became Comic Cat. Comic Cat is now is still the largest convention in the world. It's 3 times larger than San Diego Comic-Con, held twice a year. No pros, no concerts, no panels. It's one giant artist alley where everyone's selling their yaoi, yuri, Dondinshi.
Where's this?
It's in Japan.
Yep.
So it's a thing that's been around, and I think that's actually interesting because I think that's what people were thinking furries were for the longest time. Like you see the same reaction because I saw the same thing happen with the Trekkies and with the anime fans and with the bronies, where the mainstream media says, oh, these are weird adults partaking in this weird thing. And the furries especially, we saw this in the 90s, news outlets like try to paint furries, especially furry cons, as something dark and dingy when anime cons were having yaoi paddles, and the body pillows. But now I think especially what we see here with Anthrocon this year, like it's been really embraced. Like with how Comic-Con in the mid-2000s went from being a sub-geek culture to now a mainstream pop culture phenomenon where everyone wants to take part of it. I think this is what Anthrocon is. And so yes, I think some things I thought were family-friendly in general history, I realized a lot of people thought was like something weirder, but I think those attitudes will eventually pass. And hopefully more attention will be taken on that, because we, especially with transformation, we have had so much Disney movies in a lot. Disney movie has always had transformation.
Yeah.
Then we had Luca turning red come out. We had Pneumonia. We had so many different TF movies come out lately. It's and I think it's going to become mainstream now. And there's a Netflix show about a girl who turns into chicken nuggets. There's an anime that won awards about a guy who turned into a chair. I think that it's becoming mainstream now. So yeah.
Yeah, I can speak to. Oh, I guess one particular challenge of furry history is just sort of like making sure you do the research and keep writing and revising the story until it's right. Like I don't know exactly how else to say it, but I guess an example would be like I wrote a piece recently on the origin of fursonas. Where did fursonas originate? That term was not really used until 1994, but then I started thinking, well, like obviously there was animal identification in the furry fandom, the early furry fandom, starting from the mid to late 80s and 90s, and like even if it wasn't called a fursona, it had to be something. So I discovered that there was a sequence of terminology that furries were using. So I had to chart that history, and that just involved a lot of like interviews and going back and making sure I wasn't missing anything. And I had a really wonderful opportunity to interview the originator of fursonas. Anyone know who created? Ken Sample, yeah, Ken Sample, and it was a marvelous and powerful interview, not least because Ken said basically like. So when the fandom documentary came out, Ken got a lot of attention suddenly because the fandom documentary also names Ken as the originator of fursonas, rightly so, because Ken was the first person who was drawing animal avatars of his friends. These were like the fursonas. These were sort of like the first fursonas. And Ken's real anxiety that he expressed to me was like, he said after the fandom documentary came out, he searched for 2 weeks to see if there was somebody before him who had come out with fursonas, and he didn't come up with anything. And I was like, yeah, I've done a ton of searching too, and I haven't come up with anything either. Like I'm sure people were identifying with animals, but it wasn't the same thing as a fursona. That's kind of a distinct thing, even before it had that name. So trying to carve out what exactly a fursona is when it started in furry history, and understanding Ken Sample's perspective of like, I myself was really nervous. Ken told me, like I wasn't sure if I was the originator, but like he and I haven't been able to find any other sort of evidence to the contrary. So, you know, it's like you really have to dig deep in order to find the story, and the story gets more nuanced and complicated. And so the worry I have is like, not digging deeply enough, or that stuff is missing, and if stuff is missing, can you tell the story fully?
Yeah, to jump in on that, for me, oh, yeah.
Just a quick question. Was that pre-furry muck or post-furry muck?
Pre-furry muck.
Okay.
Just pre-furry muck.
But just
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah, furry muck also has a lot. Yeah.
Thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah, so jumping on that point, for me, a lot, so I grew up in a predominantly Mexican household, and a lot of my life was like trying to fit into like this box of like white essentialism. Like you're not queer, you're not disabled, you are this perfect golden child. And you know, when you get to working on your college degrees, literature, as a queer person, you're like trying to find that spark, that little piece of, like Tofte, you were mentioning like classics, thinking about where's queerness here in this like space of supposed archival like emptiness in terms of queerness. And when I started my own research with furry, going into the Fred Patton papers and really trying to find like where's transness, where's queerness, and I realized a lot of that was my own attachment and trying to find that exact thing. But we find like with furry, it bleeds, it changes, it's not exactly what we're looking for. And when it comes up, it's like, oh my God, it's there. And specifically, one of the things that I like to look at within the amateur press associations are the more radical histories. So like, where does blackness show up in the fanzines and archive? Where does queer transness, feminism show up? And in Rowbrestle, there were moments where, you know, evangelical or Christian thought were coming up saying, you know, we need to keep this synced to God or else we'll be sinful. And that shook up fans, and fans commented on it as fans and APAs did. And that was really powerful, especially to think about within predominant culture, looking aside from furry, fans are still thought of as fanatics. I mean, it's been commodified by Disney and Marvel recently as, you know, they're exploiting our interests to get more capital into their studios. But there was recently a book on perverts and looking at the political ideas of perverts and furries in it. And so we're seen as perverts still. But then also there was another book where they pointed out that fans are like religious cults. And so for me, working with furry and history is not only like telling the right story or telling it the right way, but also thinking about like where are the nuances, the messiness, where does the idea someone has of the community break in, so to speak, some way. But this kind of leads, of course, into the next question, which is, so we know that history can lead to problematics. So history developed out of the 18th and into the 19th century, predominantly as historians were given access to the archives after the French Revolution. And Hayden White looks at how by going into the archives, there was this positivist ability to prove certain things happened. And so elite voices were shown and celebrated, but also things were silenced as they were trying to protect those in elite power structures. With furry, do you find that there are moments where, because of our, let's say, minoritarian or more radical approaches to things, there are ways in which we kind of mess with history or kind of show things as denser than what people typically think of?
Yeah, that's actually been my fear with, especially my con history thing, because I have to look at all these different fandoms. I think that's why I've been kind of very hesitant, even looking at furry academic research. I've been cautious of using that until it backs up something I found independently of that, because specifically, I think before I started the furry fandom, I was involved in the brony fandom, and the bronies were also equally ostracized and had a similar, go at things. So you started seeing a lot of brony studies, and some of them were legit. They were organized by PhDs and stuff, and but even if you are a PhD or working in tandem with a university and say you're academic, there's a lot of people who self-publish, vanity journals and stuff, which I don't completely agree with. And especially if you take a lot of them are based on surveys. And if you take a survey in your fandom, and your fandom wants to portray itself in the most positive light, of course they're going to try to answer that survey in the nicest, cleanest way possible without going through a lot of the more subversive tropes that, I think it's rightfully fair. Like, bronies, furries, Trekkies, anime fans, all of them do have a very adult side, also a very, very family-friendly side, but I think a lot of that is tempered based on the surveys, based on how the questions are worded. That's why I don't normally always agree with the surveys as well. That's why I always look at that very, very last. Yeah. But at the same time, anyone could say I'm publishing a history, so you need something to make it at least some baseline, so it's like someone's not making something up, which I've seen a lot. Like famously with the con history side, I've always heard that the mother and father of cosplay, Forrest J. Ackerman and Moroyo, were dating boyfriend-girlfriend. Went back to the contemporary fanzines, could not find any of it, even though it's cited on Wikipedia and even all the fan lore wikis. I can't find any contemporary sources of that, so even stuff like that, I have to be very, very cautious with. So that's why surveys specifically, I'm just a little cautious now in anything that's a brony or a furry or a Trekkie academic published thing. I'm cautious until I know the people behind it and if they have an agenda or not, because sometimes you don't know. There might be groups with specific agendas behind trying to paint their fandom in a positive light.
Yeah, and I think furry particularly, I think aspects of furry particularly, there are people who fit the image that gets represented as folks try to work for dignity, as try to protect themselves but then there are so many more other furries who like do the radical thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, you hear a story from somebody, it's never gonna be the same fandom. For me, I like to look at the literature because it lets me look at the emotions that draws one to the community and maybe thinks about like the surrounding political culture. So I'm thinking of like Shantae Howard's Extinctioners or Circles by Stu Domansky, Andrew French, Scott Bobyanek, Omaha the Cat Dancer, and the 1980s and 90s. For you both, do you feel like as you're working with history, furry playfully pushes against, in some ways, against your work, or maybe just the stories told about furry?
I actually am going to push back on that one a little bit
Yeah.
and say that, you know, furries are people like all people, and we as, you know, as a community and as individuals fall into exactly the same traps.
Right.
And are informed by exactly these same assumptions that, you know, have informed professional historical research about non-furry stuff, right? You know, and I think one good example of this is the obsession with firsts, or the obsession with finding the founder, right? So who started furry? Who, you know, where's the moment we can point to and say, this is when furry came into being, right? And this is something, you know, like I fall into the trap too. And there are lots of research questions that I form that are like, oh, I wonder where the earliest whatever, right? So an example of a project that I've been working on recently is trying to find the first instance of the word furry as we mean it in print. And it is today is the 39th anniversary of the first instance of furry in print. July 5th, 1985, there is a bulletin that advertised the first prancing skill tear party at WesterCon 38, in Sacramento, San Diego?
I'm not sure.
I can't remember.
We'll check.
California. You know, and there was a call for people who are hosting room parties. Hey, could you come and advertise that if you're doing that? And one of the first groups to come and do that were Mark Merlino and Rod O'Reilly, Cy Sable, Vincent Mink, because they were hosting this party, this prancing skill tear party for fans of Japanimation, the Other Sons TTRPG, and fans of the furry fandom, right? So this is the first moment in print. But this isn't the first time that people are using this term, right? That's lost. That is irrecoverable. And there are lots, so Chipper kind of alluded to this talking about personas, right? There are lots of terms that predate the first use of furry that people are using to try to describe what we have come to mean by the word furry, right? And there's a huge variety. You know, fuzzies, we could have been fuzzies. Sit with that for a second. We could have been, I shit you not, we could have been zoophiles. Like that was in circulation in the early 80s as is. Right. So there, you know, I think that something that's really cool about doing furry history is that you might fall into an assumption and you might fall into a question or a pattern, but you know, when you're doing the work, you have this kind of opening up of possibility because, you know, I think you're right. Like furry is messy. It is way messier than a lot of things, and it's really hard to tell a linear narrative. Or like you start trying to tell it, and then you get a little bit along the way, and you're like, I can't. It doesn't work this way, right? Like I can't write this narrative, right? I don't know how many open, started, half-finished Google Docs I've got because I'm like, well, I can't answer this until I go and answer this.
And to agree with your pushback, Lauren Berlant wrote a book called Cruel Optimism, thinking about how our attachments can oftentimes, as researchers, hold us back from the work we're trying to do. And I think once you get into whatever you're doing research on, you start to see the thoughts you had going into the project as being deflated in some way. but also you come with new nuances, new questions that really not necessarily make the history process messier, though it can, but it dimensionalizes it in a way that you maybe didn't recognize.
Yeah. Yes, we also in Fursona history were personal furries for a while, which still on some level exists, and also avatars was a pretty common term for some time. And that was especially true in Furry Muck. In fact, there was a connected archive called the Avatar Archive, linked to Furry Muck, which is a very early art archive that you can still access today. It's actually still available. So if you want to see early art of folks' Furry Muck characters, which was a text-based world, you can still find the Avatar Archive. It's really cool. Lots of art from 1990 to 1993 or so. But yeah, just to build on this conversation, digital furry work in particular is complicated because furries move across media often really quickly. So trying to keep pace with, I don't know, when I was writing about TF and furry fandom sort of overlapping in the 90s and early 2000s. Yeah, I mean, like, it starts with, I don't know, Usenet archives, alt.horror.werewolves, and then there's like kind of early, there's like Transfer, which has its own whole history, the website Transfer, art archives, or like personal art websites are sort of becoming a thing in the late 90s, so that's its own whole thing, and like Fur Affinity comes a little bit later. So you have to kind of keep pace with furries moving across different online communities, and some of those are well known and still up and running today, and some of them have sort of vanished. So you have to find these little bits and pieces where you can and try to piece the story together as well as you can. Yeah, things like the Usenet archives are a good example. Google Groups still has a lot of archive material of the alt.fan.furry and alt.horror.werewolves, but these aren't complete archives. Some go back, I think alt.horror.werewolves goes back to I can't remember, it's like 92 or 93, but some of the earliest material's gone. So I would really like to track down the earliest material, but I can't find it. So if you have any leads, please talk to me.
Yeah, and sometimes that work, I think your work shows that really well. You have to speak with people who are there, and you have to be willing to have conversations with multiple people who are involved, just so you can see the nuances, but also maybe where people's own attachments. So case in point, one of the questions that I always have thinking in my mind is furry better today than it was during the 80s? And that itself is a loaded question because it asks us to think about, has furry quote unquote progressed? We think in progressive narratives with technology and things like that in some ways, but also what does it mean for me to look at furry in the past when it wasn't furry we know of today, but try to fix that in some way? Because we oftentimes think, where's queerness in the past? Where's furry? Those terms maybe didn't exist. And so that changes the conversation. And so before I get to the last question, which looks at broadening away from furry, you've all worked with history in some way, writing stories, writing projects. What does the writing process look for you, if I may ask? I know that kind of goes into like writing versus history, but like when you get started on a project, how do you get going with it? And do these questions and concerns of producing silences, overlooking things maybe come about even at an early stage?
I suppose I can start. There's a Google Doc that I start for every article, and it's mostly like a list of interviews. So there's a ton of pages that are just interviews, and then I'll have usually in that folder I'll have like websites that I know I need to go back and visit, or I'll just like create like a saved list of websites that I know are going to factor into the story. But it's a constant delay because I'll keep finding new material, and then the interview responses will give some new dimension. The writing is like 80% more than that. It's like 90% just absorbing the material, and that takes forever. Like it takes a really long time, and it still feels incomplete in sort of frustrating ways. But then the last 10% of writing it is also a little bit agonizing because because often the story that emerges is pretty complicated, and so trying to tell it in a way that's comprehensible and that sort of like that like shows like a kind of has like a narrative flow, but also does justice to the history without sort of smoothing over, I don't know, the nuance or whatever. It takes a lot of drafts, and that document of notes just gets really long, I guess.
I remember you had messaged me when we were chatting on your persona, and I was like, wait, there are underground comics where people depicted themselves as animals.
Yeah.
And it was just like, wait, hold on, do you have those scans?
Yeah.
Do you have those listed?
Mm-hmm.
If you ever go to the Eaton, they have the copy there, so you can always like hold it and be like, oh. But that's one case where it's like you start a project and it goes wherever direction it's gonna go. And thank God for Google Docs, you know? Like, you just keep adding.
Yeah, and like the I don't know, one of my big things is like furry history is a communal project. We have to do it together because we have to hear from everybody, because everyone has a different thing to contribute. So like that's an invitation. Like if you have furry history or like a story or something, please share it with us, because we want to record that history, you know. And there's so much we do not yet know.
So I guess I am Fang, Feather, and Fin's resident hoarder, and I am deeply grateful to my very patient and supportive partner for being okay with that. So often my work starts with just trying to find the damn thing, just find a damn thing. And you know, we've got about 6,500 furry comics and fanzines at this point that have, frankly, taken thousands of hours, thousands of miles of driving. I've been to 156 comic book shops in the past 3 years.
Around the East Coast.
Around the East Coast, yes. I have a Google map that keeps track of it all. You know, and a lot of money. It takes a lot of money to do this. You know, one of the tricks about, I think one of the great difficulties of doing furry history is so many of furry's documents are ephemeral, and they're part of pop genres that research libraries have not traditionally collected. You know, the patent collection and the Stu Schiffman collection at UC Riverside is a phenomenal resource and is an amazing thing. You know, it's also mostly unprocessed, and so it's difficult to access and to know what's there. You know, so often, you know, I just try to, I find a thing and I'm like, I don't know what that thing is. I guess I'll just buy it. And you know, I was in a comic shop in Connecticut a couple of weeks ago and was browsing through these fanzines that were unpriced, and you know, there were 2 issues of Phronography. And I was just like, oh shit, this is definitely furry porn, and this is definitely like ye oldie furry porn. So 1989, so Phronography #1 was published by Brenda and Rob Davrin, who are incredibly generous people when you reach out to them with emails and say, hey, remember when you published porn back in the 80s? How'd that go? So they're fun people. But you know, I just found it. It wound up costing me $5 each, and it was one of those, like, you just read it and it just provokes all these questions, and so you start making lists of questions and you start asking yourself, like, okay, you know, why did this come about? And you know, Brenda says in an editorial, you know, I did this because Ed Vick, who was editor of Moo Press, a really important furry press that is now defunct. Ed Vick is the editor of Rowbrazzle today. Rowbrazzle is still going. You know, Ed Vick wrote a review of another apazine called Furversion. That you know, Ed called it furry porn, and Brenda was like, you know, you think that's furry porn? I'll show you furry porn. You know, and you know, the idea of like, oh, you know, this is a moment of creation. Like, why are people doing this at this moment? How are they distributing it? How are people responding to it? how did Ed feel about being called out at this moment, right? And there's just piles of questions that pop up. And I would say, that for me is often like the most consuming moment in the writing process, is just the explosion of questions in response to a thing in front of you that you're just trying to understand small little bits about.
So if you look at my Google Docs drive, it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of unfinished drafts of countless different histories. I honestly just tried to see, okay, will this work as a linear chronological timeline, and then kind of just make a rough outline and go from there. I find myself in an interesting thing where I'm trying to balance the different sections of history. I want to give equal weight to different time periods, equal weight to different fandoms, equal weight to different groups. And I find some areas are always lacking. This has been something even before my con history with my other history books I've written, where there's been such little information on specific things that I had to find the very little threads and scraps I could and try to expand that as much as I can, thirsting for anything I could find. And then suddenly some archive or book or some packet of papers are found, and instantly I have more information that I consume. And then that's actually why the con history book has been taking so long, because I had literally nothing about the First World Con. And all of a sudden within the last few years, everything just popped up. I'm like, wow, there's just so much more than what I had to go through. And it's also the balance between different groups. Some fandoms are really, really good at documenting the history. Science fiction fandom and furry fandoms, really, really good at documenting their history. The comics fandom and anime fandoms, literally nothing. But I want to give each fandom equal weight. So it's how do I make sure everything is equal? So that does involve me trying to write a rough of what I have available. Then as more information comes back, having to rewrite to the point where it's okay, I have to admit, I can't salvage, just toss it out and just start over again, which I've done many, many times. So yeah, it's just the process for me, the cycle.
Yeah, I will say, for me, the hardest part is, because furry in many ways acts as a special interest for me. It's my little safe space. I can go there, pretend, but also recognize why I'm pretending. And as I'm starting a project, I have to call out what are my attachments to this and how do I put them aside, so that way I pay attention to the reality of the years or whatever I'm looking at. But sometimes even as I'm ready for that and going into the archive, they don't have the documents. There was this moment where for my introduction for my dissertation, I was I feel like I have to explain to non-furries the history of furry. And I have Joe Strike's book to cite, I have all these other documents that fans have to look to, but I need to look at Booty as this underground text. And for the longest time, we had in the Eaton collection, Booty issue 0, and I couldn't find it. There was Booty issue, and it was a newsletter, and I was okay, let me ask the processing archivist. And he just looked at me that's all we have, I'm sorry. And then as I'm finishing my dissertation, we got the Stu Schiffman collection, and we have a pretty substantial run of Booty, except missing a couple issues early on. And I was I need to rewrite my intro now, or realize it's not as important as I thought it was. And so getting the documents did change the process, but I feel like any writing project, you're gonna hit bumps, you're gonna get bruises, you're gonna find yourself having to carve out more time at the archive or the library, and that does affect, ultimately where you sit with the work. I have other questions, but I feel like we touched on them. I'd rather, if we feel comfortable, maybe jumping into questions. Whether you're working on history projects, you're curious, what are some questions maybe that you have for us, respectively or otherwise? Yes.
So I love furry history in general. I absolutely adore it. And I guess as one of the people who does the survey research, I'm curious about, is there a way to make it more useful to historians? Because I agree with all the points that you make about the survey research that we do, that there's inherent biases in self-report and what people are willing to talk about. And I guess in terms of thinking about, how could historians ever use this data, or is it just either antithetical to doing historical research or just not useful at all to a historian? Is there any sort of suggestions you have or thoughts you have for how to do the research that we do over at First Science to try to make it more useful in the future, thinking ahead and trying to be, what would be helpful to historians that we collect, what kinds of things? Is it using more qualitative research rather than quantitative research? Is it collecting large amounts of words and stories rather than statistics? So any suggestions you have? Not to put you on the spot.
No, I actually do like First Science, but yeah, my issue with survey was when I first entered the Brony fandom and saw how differently a lot of the questions were worded. And of course, Bronies have completely different, they don't have to deal with the different types of species for personas. One of the things I wish the early Brony surveys would have is more about gender identity and sexuality. Because what's interesting is, when Brony started, everyone thought it was a predominantly male fandom until we realized it's actually predominantly trans female fandom. But people didn't realize that till later on. So I would love surveys if they could keep at least a lot of the questioning consistent, so we could go back over the years and see how the questions, the answers change over time. Like, that would be a great way to do it. One thing that I like about First Science is like the different species questions and just seeing the trends of which species become popular, because I like Alan Moore's idea of like you have to look at history holistically. So you could take that survey and then say, okay, why are foxes more popular? It's like, oh, Zootopia came out. Or why are wolves more popular? Oh, okay, Bad Guys came out. So I love seeing, okay, what was the survey saying? And then seeing what the holistic trends in culture were around that time and building from it. I think just surveys, as long as they are consistent, so we could use at least the same data point. So if the question is worded near the same for like 10 years, that's better than changing the question completely each year.
I guess the only problem we run into with that is then as terminology changes, as we become more familiar, it's like, well, do we stick with the old bad wording, or do we, switch over to the,
Like, just put parentheses, this is what it used to be, but.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think for me, statistics are another document to be read, to be analyzed and thought through, and they kind of fall into the puzzle with history. But I always look at how history is partly storytelling. And to like bring that in, we also need to consider like the performative oral traditions, the ways people speak, tell stories of their fandom, and look at like holistically. And I think surveys fall into that, particularly what are the questions that are asked at a particular moment in time, and how does that play into how the fandom understands itself as, let's say, for instance, furry is growing every day. I mean, I'm scared to look at the numbers for this con, just based on the reg. And the thing with surveys is not everyone is always going to go to surveys. I feel bad for Jimmy John's. Every time I order, they ask me for a survey. I'm like, no. And so, like, playing with it's always that question of, like, how do I keep up with something that's always ahead? And I think those written answers can play a good part in that. There was another hand.
There were a few hands.
Yeah, in the back.
What's your dream item to find right now that you're looking for?
Oh, I'm going to pass it down to Hunter.
Dream item.
If you had to find the one thing.
Actually, my dream item came up in an auction 3 weeks ago. The very first Hugo Award awarded to Forrest J. Ackerman came up in auction, and it was estimated to be about $5K. So I was like, okay, I'll put $3K up. Actually, it happened during a PonyCon, so I was actually live bidding while it was happening. And it quickly went up to $12K. So it was way outside my range. But I'm happy other people appreciate the history. But outside of that first Hugo Award, my dream item was the very first WorldCon programming book, the very first con book. And because there's no good scans online, and I finally got one on eBay, I was able to whittle down a few hundreds. It's still a few $100s. And I picked it up, 85-year-old con book, and I realized why I couldn't be scanned. It was all gold leaf foiling everywhere. But I did find that as my dream item, and I'm very, very happy with that. And I guess the goal now is to find the first con book for every single new genre of con. But at least I got the Holy Grail, at least.
this is a bit of a cop-out, but I just want a complete record of the furry Usenet groups, just like the full thing, like all of the conversation threads and all of the replies, so that I can watch them unfold. Because like the conversations build on each other. You can watch a flame war unfold, and like if you don't have a complete record, then you just can't. You'll always have a incomplete story. So I just want like a complete record of the thing, which in this case is many things, because there were different groups.
Do you have a dream item, Todd?
Everything. No. You know, I mean, I also, you know, this would be a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I snagged it 2 weeks ago. I managed to get a copy of Raoul Brazel #1, which Fred Patton, from whom this collection comes, and who was, you know, the unofficial fan historian for furry for many years. You know, Fred Patton points to it as the moment that furry is identifiable as distinct, that it has become a thing that is separable from sci-fi, underground. You know, it's starting to form as its own thing. So like that was incredibly cool to be able to see and to preserve. Raoul Brazel #2 would be great.
Yeah. Is this mic still working?
It's not, no.
Yeah.
Oh, little button here. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, wow.
It's popping in and out.
Oh, I see.
We need Brony AV here.
Yes.
Are they better than?
Oh yeah, that was a joke of a panel. Like
A little more slack.
Furry cons are hiring Brony AV now.
Oh, I love that. I was a brony for some time, and so like I always go back and forth between I'm a pig this week, I'm an alicorn next week. As I finish the dissertation, I have to actually start getting rid of stuff in my house, furry materials, and so like I don't know if I have a dream object, but I would love I haven't found it yet, but right around the time of 1980s, issue 4 of Raoul Brazel, there was art submitted by Steve Martin and others that was deemed too adult for the APA. And Mark Schurmeister and others saw Raoul Brazel as an extension of Booty, just, you know, fans doing things they want to do. But I would really love to see what was in issue 4, because Riverside has issues 1, 2, and 3, 5, 6, 7. And I like foamed at the mouth when I realized we didn't have it, but we have issue 5, 6, and 7 where they're talking about it. And there's a beautiful letter written by Ken Sample where he's telling fans, it's not our job to say who can submit what, that's the editor, and we should respect the editor to make the decision. But every time, you know, the archivist asks, like, Brandy, if we need to purchase anything, what do we need to purchase? I'm like, find this issue. Like, find it. And it's been written down, I've seen it on a whiteboard, like, find it. And so they're looking, but any other questions? Yes?
You're a professor at UC Riverside, is that right?
I actually graduated. I moved, now I'm teaching at Cal State Los Angeles for sci-fi.
Cal State, you mean the Golden Eagles, Cal State?
Yes.
Okay. Does UC Riverside have any archives on this, or will have archives?
On furries?
On furries?
Yeah, so the Eden collection has actually existed at UC Riverside since the late 20th century, the late 1900s, sorry. And they have the Fred Patton collection. And so before Fred passed away, he donated as much of his materials as possible, and fans brought all of the documents that he had to the archive. And then recently we got Stu Schiffman materials, which includes Booty as much as Schiffman had. And that's predominantly where I worked. And the archive is open access public, meaning that you don't have to be a student, you just have to set up an account on Aeon.
I'm a UC alumnus, so.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
I can just go on campus and just look at it.
Yeah, so you would have to make an account on Aeon, which you can do in the reading room. The materials can't leave the library. You would have to read them in the reading room. But sometimes it's like, almost like this prophetic experience of like, putting down the text and you're like, this is Raoul Brazel #1, I'm so sorry, baby, I have to open you. And so it's all there. The thing is, They do not have online access because much of it is non-processed. They actually had to introduce their undergrad students to furry when I started doing an internship. They're like, we showed them documents, they had a bad time. Like, they didn't know what they were looking at. And so, but you can request prints and copies, and they'll send them to you as PDFs.
That's great.
And
As
so-
a local, I have
Yeah.
access to that.
So as long as you show up, you spend like a week working with the documents, and if you like something, or if you know it's there, you can order copies of it. I've ordered so much, like my bank account hurts. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question for Tofte. It goes in the sort of the similar direction. Since you described yourself as the hoarder, so what are the further plans to do with the hoard? Like, are you going to make it also accessible in the form? Are you going to digitize it, or also thinking in terms of preservation? What are your plans?
Excellent question. So the short answer is, so Fang, Feather, and Fin provisionally intends to take everything in the collection and deposit it in a public research library or university library like the UC Riverside Eaton collection, but probably not in California because people in California already have access to that.
We're stingy.
That's
We
true.
are, we are.
That's true. It's not going to be at my university because BC's not down with furry porn. So eventually, like part of the joy of doing this work is creating a project and an archive that will be accessible to everybody. Everybody will be able to come and look at these things and do the research that it's so hard to do right now. We are working on digitizing. So, the trick about digitization is everything's still in copyright. Everything that any furry has ever produced is still in copyright. And it, by and large, because of how furries work, individual creators have kept copyright to all of their own individual works. And also, because furry works so collectively, so many of the furry publications, so much of furry ephemera is made up, it has 20 chefs in the kitchen. So Ralbrazzle, like I'm in Ralbrazzle, and there's 35 people who own copyright to 35 different things. And you need everybody's permission to digitize and post it.
Have you considered maybe working with the Internet Archive, who have like a library exemption for kind of stuff like that?
So here is something really tricky about this. There are a lot of first-gen furs who got screwed over by people, digitizing their work and sharing it, and then nobody was willing to pay the $3 that their comic cost that would have kept them going, right? And so their comic failed. Their comic, they couldn't produce it anymore. We have talked with a ton of furs and have talked about the work that we're doing and have asked, would you be interested in? We have pro bono copyright lawyers from an intellectual property clinic at Suffolk University that help us out with this. So some people, they don't want it. They do not want it. Some people want it, but they're cautious, right? Terry Smith and Glenn Wooten are a good example of people who got screwed over pretty badly and are really passionate about creators' rights. And so they don't want to say yes and hand things over, but they would like things to be preserved, right? And so finding that balance. So the difficulty of just being why don't I just go to the Internet Archive? They potentially have the legal right to do this. They have a library exemption.
But people
right?
would still hate you.
So it is such a small community, and we are so dependent on the goodwill of the community and on the goodwill of furries and fur creators that we simply cannot burn a bridge. We will not ever violate the copyright of a furry creator under no circumstances. Thank you. It's just ethical, right? It's just I posted just a photo of Ralbrazzle #1 when I got it on Blue Sky, an hour after it came in the mail, and this one dude was the Bolsheviks were right about academics and should get rid of look at this terrible capitalist pig, hoarding these things. I'm just I bought it from a dude who had it out of box for 35 years, and I'm trying my best, but like, these people own the copyright, and I'm simply not going, like, we are a community of artists. We are a community of artists who understand how important it is to respect that. And so we're always going to do that. If we just go to the Internet Archive and and people have done this, and this is not a criticism of them. This is a personal ethical stance, right? It just burns bridges. It just burns bridges, and people have burned bridges already that we now can't mend. And stuff is just, one of the frustrations that you have to get to okay with when doing furry work is you will fail. You will fail at preserving everything. You will fail at finding the answers to the things you want. You have to be okay with you just can't do everything that you want to do. So working with our IP clinic, we are trying to get permissions from folks. I've got a big old spreadsheet with people who have said yes. There are also some complications, right? There are people who published under their real names and they don't want that circulated. There are people who published under NDAs and presses can't tell me who that person is. There are people who published under dead names and they don't want that dead name out there anymore, right? There are people for whom a work was problematic and they just don't, that's not a thing they want preserved, or they don't want it, maybe it can be preserved and there's nothing you can do about it, but they don't want it distributed, right?
I feel you, by the way. Just to give you a little perspective why I'm asking that question is, I'm personally always a little bit paranoid about preservation. I also wanted I also probably have a couple of material that you maybe don't have yet. I'm actually the chairman of Eurofurence. I've been with the fandom since '95 or so. So
can we do an interview and a blog post at some point?
Yeah.
I love talking about furry history, and there's not a lot of documentation about European furry history out there.
Oh.
And so I have a couple of like old zines and stuff like that. I have like a pretty bit rotty but rather complete archive of the Eurofurence mailing list going back to 2001 maybe, and stuff like that you might be interested in. And also, I would like to give the stuff that I've been in boxes for like 30 years to someone who can actually, do something useful with it, and that's why I was asking, because I know it a little bit from the vintage computer community, that very often there's people who are collecting old hardware and stuff like that, so people send it to them, and sometimes they make a little museum out of that, but then, stuff happens, they get sick, they run out of money, they pass away, and all this stuff suddenly ends up in a warehouse somewhere, rotting there for another 10 years, and then it gets all scrapped. So, so I would like to know where the stuff is going if I give you something. So that's why I asked.
Yeah, absolutely, and
also,
we can chat. And I 100% get you. I think personally, the idea of trying to establish a furry museum is a fool's errand.
No, you can't do that.
You can't do. Small museums are constantly dying. There was a really interesting research article recently about, COVID killed 20% of small museums in the United States.
Yeah.
And these community museums are desperately trying to make ends meet. They have real estate that they're trying to manage. And so one of the reasons that we sort of have intentionally decided that this is going to get deposited in a pre-existing research library is that we do not have the expertise or the money to establish, a fund that can guarantee that we can hire a preservationist who deals with textile, right? We can't do that. Nobody. I mean, if there's some Powerball winners out there, right? Not just like suspiciously wealthy. If any of you are not just like suspiciously wealthy furs, but like eye-wateringly, feel free. I'm delighted to chat with you, right? But there are already places with expertise, with Chipper and I are academics. We depend for our lives on staff who know what they're doing that we don't.
Yeah.
We depend for our lives on institutional policies, on institutional resources, on institutional, physical plant that makes sure that somebody can access this, right? Because a little tiny museum is going to die, and it's a waste of money. It's a waste of money that could go to
Absolutely.
actual work. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox.
Real quick, I just want to call out, your occurrence is the longest continually running con.
Yeah, that's
And
only
the
because-
vast majority of that cheetah has running. So give that man a hand.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I like to say it's only the longest continually running furry con because we started counting earlier than we did count our 12 people party at someone's holiday cabin as the number one. So we kind of cheated our way into history.
Was
a little bit.
that Ian Curtis's house party?
No, actually that was way after that. That was, Eurofriends 1 was a meeting of 12 people who met on Furry in '95. And we literally just met at someone's cabin. It was Tess, was his name, Tess Tuihar. Might ring a bell with grain muzzles in the room, because he's been around, and we felt like the pioneers. It's like, what the hell?
12 people.
Yeah, 12 people, and it was a joke. It was not. When we called it Eurofurrence, the other running furrycon was Conference, and we said, okay, we're doing like the secret European branch of Conference, and we called it Eurofurrence, and that name was not supposed to stick. 30 years later, here we are. So.
I'm sure Rodney knows.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
I don't want to hijack this panel. I could probably tell you like an hour afterwards about that. If I'm allowed to steal maybe another minute.
Yeah.
Also, you mentioned the Avatar archive, and speaking about preservation, the Avatar archive was considered lost for quite a while because the original administrator who ran it at forgetting the name of the college.
S&C.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was Salis, was it? He transferred all the files to Wookie and his Foundation server, and then the Foundation server at some point broke down, and it turned out Visa didn't have any backups. So it was offline for a long time, and a good friend of mine, Holger, was still a part of Furry and Tapestries and all the old-timey, online community. And he was still in contact with Salis, and Salis was diagnosed with cancer. So he knew he had a very, very limited time to live. And Holger actually asked him if we could get a physical copy of that hard drive. And he said, well, it doesn't look like I'm going to be home anytime anymore. So, but I will tell my family about this, and I will tell them where the hardware is, where the server is, and if you can preserve this, then please do. That was about 10 years ago, or maybe even more. And so we got in contact with the family, and it was really, really hard to get in contact because they were wondering who the fuck we were and why those PCs. Well, it was like a big Unix server. Was what that was about. But Holger managed to actually talk to them to actually mail it over to Germany, basically, and we were able to restore that from the hard drive, and that's why it is online now. So we put it back.
That's incredible.
So if you go, I think it's furry.de/avatar, you can still browse the original archive. And we too had some thoughts about, are we even legally allowed to do this? Because there's artwork from probably 100 artists on there, and nobody gave us ever permission to republish it. So we were having the same discussion going like, can we do this? So far, nobody complained, so I guess we're good.
Yeah.
But also, we still have the original hardware there. So if you know of anybody who wants to put this like in a museum or anything, we still have it. It's still there. And also, if you guys have any good ideas what to do with the data, we're having backups of it now. So at least that's done.
So we have time for maybe one more question.
Sorry for that, but I.
No
Yeah,
worries.
that's great.
Amazing.
I'm going to go to the very back with the green hair.
This is tangentially linked. In y'all's research, have you found any connections between the evolution of Western furdom versus non-Western furdom, or has it basically been Western central?
I mean, so the short answer is there are ways in which a lot of furry culture is sort of dictated by traditions of American practice, but so that like sort of in the way that like American media has infected everything everywhere, but global furry is incredibly complex and rich, and and I think that this again kind of gets to this question of like, oh, when did furry get invented, or like how can you draw the line? There are people who are proto furries or whatever you want to call them outside of the U.S. Before conference, before Raubrazel, and I think this gets into a larger kind of philosophical question of where do you want to draw the line for what constitutes furry and what doesn't, right? Does ancient Greco-Roman animal costume practice and ritual qualify as furry, right? No. But also, yeah, right? Like, and I think, especially like, there's a huge set of kind of cross-pollination between, Japanese kimono culture and Korean furry culture and Chinese and U.S. furry culture, for sure. European furry culture is different from something that I found really striking. We went to the UK a couple years ago, and fur meets are so common, and so like you just hang out with furries every month, and you just go to the same bar and the same pub, and we all come to Pittsburgh once a year, right? There are a lot of people who experience furry as an annual experience, right? As a huge drive yourself into the ground, forget 621, right? I'm not sleeping, I'm not eating, I got time for nothing. I gotta fur this up. And so there are a lot of complex cultural traditions, I think, and it isn't just an American phenomenon, though American furry is a really important strain of what has happened everywhere.
Yeah, I think if you see any of the kimono suits evolve really, really differently from what we see the fursuits suits here, which are more originally based off the sports style mascot, the original Disney mascot style suits. But it's a very big interplay, and I think Japan specifically seems to be really interested with the trade back and forth, specifically with the United States. If you look at any other culture as well, especially animation, you can see Disney inspiring all other stuff, and heading back and forth. We see this with a lot of the different fandoms and communities as well. A lot of stuff were evolved independently, like the Artist Alley evolved in Japan and the United States separately. Underground comics and dondenshi evolved around the same time, but completely different. But then there's a lot of interchange. Comic Ket came out from a Western style science fiction convention, and then even though Japan invented anime, the idea of an anime con was really a purely American thing. In fact, when anime cons are held in Japan, they call them American style conventions because it's pros meeting fans, which was unheard of back then when Comic Con was just essentially one giant fan run artist alley. So it's interesting that it does seem to spring out from Japan, and then Japan has influenced how, we're saying, the fursuits in Korea and China and Taiwan were made. But interesting back and forth interplay.
It doesn't look like we're being pushed out of a room. So maybe one more question. You in the blue shirt?
There's been several discussions today kind of about unstructured primary sources or missing ephemera, because at the time you might not have realized it was going to be so interesting. Is there anything that we can do now to help to figure out what is that interesting ephemera in the future?
So, make a will. I know we're all gonna laugh at that, but I mean this absolutely genuinely, seriously. No matter your age, you should be deciding what you want done with your furry material.
I just did that.
Good, excellent. You should decide what you want done with it. It doesn't, if you want it burnt, great. If you want it given to friends, great. If you want it, donated to one of the archive projects that's out or sent to UC Riverside, great. Anything is fine, but please, 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 start thinking about end-of-life planning and start thinking about the control over furry media and over, and don't think of anything as, not important or not important enough to be preserved, right? Most stuff people, wasn't important enough to be preserved, and we have it by accident, right? I do not think that, Cy and Vincent could possibly understand at the time when they were developing Conference what this was going to be, right? And I don't think that the Voodie and the Rowbrowser folks understood what was going to come out of this. I think a lot of first infers don't like what has come out of it, right? Because it has taken on a life of its own. But nothing is too small, and make those decisions now. We have struggled with really heartbreaking stories of family members getting furry stuff and being like, oh, this is some weird shit that Uncle Mike was into, and they'd throw it in the dumpster, right? Or there's a semi-famous story about Max Black Rabbit. After Max Black Rabbit passed, his aunt browbeat people who he had sold his art to send it to her, and she burnt it. And so a lot of Max Black Rabbit's originals are gone. Ian Curtis is sometimes cited as the sort of founder of furry culture in the UK because he was hosting really early furry parties. Ian Curtis died. He didn't have a will. His house was bought by a sort of random cleaner. They sold a bunch of stuff as a job lot to a guy who sold things at flea markets south of London. A random dude bought some of it, and his son, went on a message board and was like, I got some weird furry shit. Does anybody know who this Ian Curtis was? And then Game Popper messaged him as like, oh yeah, Ian Curtis was really important. I just did an interview with him for my book. There are people interested in this kind of thing. And, I spent a good bit of money just trying to save what I could of Ian's stuff and have some of it. But a lot of it went in the dumpster. A lot of it often goes in a dumpster.
It's happening too many times.
It's happening too many times. Make a will. Make a will now and decide what you want done with your furry materials.
It's not going to happen to me.
The dying?
Well, Joe Bear is going to go to a friend.
Okay, yeah, great. Yeah, Joe Bear will live.
So it's actually kind of funny because having to research like the science fiction fandom, because it's where all the furry and other stuff sprung from. Science fiction fandom was really into writing their own histories a lot, to a point where it's kind of a little controversial because the earliest history of the science fiction fandom, The Immortal Storm, was written by Sam Moskowitz, who was also the chair of the first Worldcon. So it's like, how much bias is he having there, even though he's trying to write from an impartial perspective? But what's interesting is a lot of every decade, like they term them first fandom, second fandom. They try to write a big sweeping history on that decade of fandom, and for some reason, the 30s and 40s are so well documented, and then once you get to the 50s, it's like there's nothing to report on, and it's because something that has died off were con reports. So because traveling was much harder in the 30s and 40s, so a lot of fans would write detailed con reports in fanzines, and those con reports have been preserved. But once commercial air travel became really, really big in the 50s and 60s, con reports disappeared, and then no one know like the personal, interactions of what happened at these cons. So no one knew what happened at these cons, even though the 30s were well documented. And I think I kind of like the modern day blogs, video vlogs, reports, tweets, even tweets are kind of preserving this. And I think one of the big arguments they also have is, should we write from a neutral perspective or should you write from your own personal take? And ironically, even though academics say write from a neutral perspective, from a historical side of view, you want to know that personal take, that personal feeling, what they experienced going to that convention or how they felt when this came out or how they felt in the fandom. So I would say just preserve as much of your feelings of what's currently existing, that zeitgeist of the fandom, that convention, and try to put it somewhere online where it's preserved at least.
I would say save as much, whether you write furry stuff or you collect it, save as much of the literature of furry. Case in point, for my dissertation, I had to argue a lot with others on why furry was important. And it wasn't until I gave them a book, I gave them a comic. So one of my friends who was really critical on furries being weird, I said, here, read Kyle Gould's Bridges. And it changed them. They saw it like, I get it. I showed somebody recently Curie's anthology, Claw, I think, volume 1. And she was like, I never knew that like there was a black feminist like archive within furry. And so keep the literature and like document it. As if you see stories, if you write stories, save it, put it somewhere, because those stories have more than just a story.
Yeah, there were some amateur press associations like Huzzah and Yarf where the members would write to each other, show off their art, talk about their life. I went to this, I went to that. And extra copies would be sold at places like here at Anthrocon and so on. Some of those people are no longer with us, including Michael Scott McMurray, who was known as McMoo, and Albert Temple, who was known as Gene Catlow. So some of their work would be on there. They'd be writing to each other. A guy named Scotty Arsenal was one of the other ones and everything. A guy named Don Fields, I'm not sure if he was in the Apple, he may have been in one Apple. He was the one that kind of got me into furry, even though he didn't really consider himself a furry, because he got published in Giant Shanda Animal. And there was a little flyer for something about Albany Anthrocon 97 in it, and I started going to that. But anyway, this sort of stuff was great, where people could just write to each other, but the extra copies would go out. Though, those things. I think I contributed a couple. It was a Huzzah or something. I had a couple issues I think I donated. One was actually, I think, a tribute to McMoo, who had passed away of stomach cancer, and they had a thing called ZoniCon in his honor. So stuff like that, if you've got it, donate it to something like Fang, Feather, and Fin, or just make sure it gets somewhere. But that stuff is excellent things to look back on, back in the 80s, 90s, whatever, amateur press associations. And there have been some panels here at AC about them.
Right.
Apples. So I'm just saying apples.
Yeah.
ADA.
Yeah. So we are out of time. I know all of you have plans, hopefully food, rest, relaxation. Thank you all for sharing your night with us. It was great. If you have any questions on where to reach us, I'm Princess of Party on Twitter. I'm not going to use the other name. On Blue Sky, I'm Deep Space Swine, so Deep Space 9, but swine.
For my academic stuff, Con History on Twitter and Con History on YouTube. And some of these panelists will also be on my panel tomorrow, 90 Years of Fantasy, Furry, and Fandom, I think around the same time. So go check that out if you want to learn more about history as well.
Please find me on Telegram at Chipper and talk to me about your history, your furry history, because I would like to learn.
Go to fangfeatherandfin.com and sign up for our newsletter.
Yes.
We send out periodic updates when we post new blog articles. We've got a bunch. Life has hit us all like a ton of bricks this past year, but we've got a lot of really cool things in the works that are going to come out. You can also find me on Blue Sky, tofte.bc.social, or polt@bc.edu is my professional email address. Feel free to look me up. And yeah, if you Google furry Professor Boston College, you're going to find it. I'll just say I'm happy to stick around and answer questions if folks have them. So feel free to say hi now or anytime during AC. Thanks so much.
Hello.
quick question for the historians. In your archiving,